Hello second prep students. Today we are going to continue the novel Pride and Prejudice, Chapter 2. Mr. Bennet had a comfortable income of $2,000 a year and a pleasant house in Longbourn. Unfortunately, after his death, his daughters and his wife would not inherit him. All his fortune would go to a distant male relation, one of his relatives. Mrs. Bennet's father had been a lawyer. She had a brother and a sister. Her brother owned shops in London, and her sister, Mrs. Phillips, was married to Mr. Phillips, and they lived together in Meryton. The Bennet daughters always visited Mrs. Phillips in Meryton as a sort of entertainment. So they would go there 4 or 5 times a week. The youngest daughters, Kitty and Lydia, were regular visitors. They liked to go there more than their eldest sisters. The distance between Longbourn and Meryton was very short, and that's why they went on foot. The latest news was that the regiment had recently arrived in Meryton to spend the whole winter there, and this delighted Kitty and Lydia. So now they visited their aunt every day instead of 4 times a week. At home, they spoke about nothing other than the officers. They kept speaking about the officers and their uniforms. Even Mr. Bingley's fortune was not now their favorite topic. One morning, Mr. Bennet, after listening to their praise, he told them that he believed that they were silly. At first, he suspected it, but now he was convinced. Kitty was embarrassed. She didn't reply, but Lydia continued to express her admiration. After this, Jane received a note from Netherfield. The note was from Caroline Bingley. She was invited by her to have dinner at Netherfield. Of course, Mrs. Bennet was very glad. But then she knew that the men were not there. They would have dinner with their friends, the officers. So she had a plan. What was her plan? The weather was likely to rain, so she said that Jane would not take the carriage, but instead she would go with her own horse. So when it rains, they would invite her to spend the night. Let's see if Mrs. Bennet's plan was successful or not. On her way to Netherfield, it had started raining before Jane arrived, so she had caught cold on her wet ride. Mrs. Bennet's plan was extremely successful because instead of only spending the night, Jane would spend a few days. The next morning, after breakfast, Mrs. Bennet received a letter from her daughter, a note, telling her that she had caught cold on her wet ride and she had been invited to stay at Netherfield until she recovered. Mr. Bennet told her that if your daughter should now become seriously ill and die, that would be because of her obedience to your orders. Elizabeth felt really anxious and decided to go to her sister on foot. How long was the distance? It was 5 kilometers. She decided to go walking because she wasn't interested in riding. Kitty and Lydia accompanied her for as far as Meryton, and then they went to visit one of the officers' wives, and she left her alone. She kept walking and walking, crossing field after field, jumping over streams. Why was this? Because she was anxious to see her sister. When she knew that her sister was sick, she was very worried. When she arrived, she was totally messy. Her feet were tired, her stockings were muddy, and her face was healthily pink with exercise. She was shown straight into the sitting room. Miss Bingley and Mrs. Hurst could hardly believe that she walked all this distance in order to see her sister. She walked in such bad weather. They received her politely, but she wasn't welcomed. After this, Mr. Darcy admired her even more. Why did he admire her more? Because he believed that she was different. She was not as silly as country girls. She was extremely different. He even admired her healthy good looks. Elizabeth was very glad to be taken immediately to her sister's room. She found Jane very happy to see her. She was still very feverish and unwell. The doctor came, and after examining Jane, he advised her to stay in bed for a few days and to take some medicine. Elizabeth stayed with her all day, looking after her and taking care of her. And the Bingley sisters stayed for some time in the patient's room, and then in the afternoon, it was time for Elizabeth to leave. Jane seemed so upset, so Miss Bingley, Caroline, was obliged to invite Elizabeth to stay with her sister Jane. So they sent a servant to Longbourn to inform the Bennets that Jane was going to stay and Elizabeth as well, and to bring some clothes. That evening, Elizabeth went down to dinner. She left Jane in her bedroom. And she noticed that the Bingley sisters, their apparent concern for Jane changed to indifference in a few moments. Why was this? Mr. Bingley was the only one who was concerned of Jane's illness, but they pretended only to be caring. When Elizabeth left the room to see Jane, Caroline started criticizing Elizabeth. She didn't like her manners. She believed that she was proud, she was lacking politeness, and she has no conversation skills, no elegance, and even no beauty. Mrs. Hurst agreed, and she said that she had no good qualities other than being a good walker, because she walked for 5 kilometers. And they believed that it was extremely silly of her to come all this distance walking and to arrive messy. Bingley was not interested in the conversation. Darcy did not agree with them. He believed that when she arrived, he didn't notice that she was messy. He didn't notice her wild appearance as they described. He only liked that she was different. She was independent, unlike other country girls. Darcy, after that, said that they had low chance to find good husbands. Why was this? Because of their uncle. We said that their uncle owned shops at Cheapside. So he believed that this would lessen their chance to have good husbands. Late in the evening, when Elizabeth was satisfied that Jane was asleep, she went downstairs again. She found them sitting in the sitting room and they were playing cards. She did not like to join the game. She refused politely and she picked up a book to read. After this, Bingley said that he was very surprised to find how very accomplished all young ladies are. How do they have the time to learn all these skills? And now we are going to know Darcy's opinion of an accomplished lady. Accomplished means successful. So, he believed that an accomplished woman must have a thorough knowledge of music, singing, drawing, dancing, and modern languages. Besides all this, she has to have her manner of walking, her voice, and her behavior. So that was Darcy's opinion of an accomplished lady. And something else, she should have the improvement of her mind by wide reading. So she has to broaden her horizons by reading. So Elizabeth mockingly told him that she was very surprised that he only knew 6 accomplished women, because she had never seen such elegance and intelligence and knowledge, all this in only one woman. Mrs. Hurst and Caroline started protesting loudly and said that it was normal. They knew many women like this. And then Mr. Hurst called their attention back to the card game. So Caroline told Darcy that Miss Bingley, that Elizabeth was one of those girls who tries to appear attractive to men by undervaluing other women, and that she was only acting. Of course, Elizabeth did not hear this because she had already left. And Caroline described this as a mean trick. Darcy said that there is meanness in all the tricks used by ladies to attract men. He believed that it was the nature of ladies. Caroline was not satisfied with this answer to continue the conversation, so she ended the conversation. The next morning, Elizabeth was glad to be able to inform Mr. Bingley and his sisters that Jane was much better. And she asked for her mother to be invited in order to decide whether Jane was ready to go back home or not yet. So now, Caroline Bingley was being cunning because she started to criticize Elizabeth after she left. After this, Mrs. Bennet's visit was extremely embarrassing to Jane. What did she do when she went there? Mrs. Bennet, when she went there, she didn't believe that Jane's illness was serious. But she started showing her lack of intelligence and common sense in everything she said. She was not wise enough. Kitty and Lydia also left a very bad impression. They had been whispering together, and then suddenly Lydia, who was an attractive and confident girl of around 15, she pushed herself rudely forward, and she kept on begging Mr. Bingley to hold a ball at Netherfield. Mr. Bingley was polite enough, and he promised he would. Elizabeth and Jane were quite glad when their mother and sisters left. And Elizabeth and Jane were to stay another night, only one night, at Netherfield in order to allow Jane to recover completely. After this, the last day at Netherfield, Elizabeth noticed Darcy's admiration to her. He kept looking at her. Whenever she looked in a direction, she found him looking. The following day, Jane and Elizabeth returned back to Longbourn. Darcy had mixed feelings. He liked her, he admired her, and at the same time he was not convinced. He did not like her parents, he did not like her family, and he did not like her social standard. Whereas Bingley was extremely disappointed because Jane had left. I hope you understood the lesson. Thank you and stay safe.